May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So today I want to begin with a real life question. It's a delicate and uncomfortable question, but it is relevant and it's timely, and it's one that has already been forcing all of us to reconcile and wrestle with our beliefs and our convictions as humans and as Christians. And here's the question, and I mean this in all seriousness, this is not a joke. How did you feel this week when you found out that President Donald Trump contracted COVID? How did you feel about that? Jesus says every person is a child of God. Jesus says love your adversary. Jesus says forgive. Our baptismal covenant says respect the dignity of every human being, and I will seek and serve Christ in all people. So Donald Trump is a child of God, but also so are millions of others in our nation who we might believe are harmed directly by Donald Trump's presidency. And so the question is, how do you pray? Do you pray for recovery or not? The most profound thing I've heard this week since that news came out actually came from the lips of my daughter. I sat her down, I was trying to explain the situation to her, and she said this. She says, you know what I want? I want Trump's power to have COVID, but I don't want him to have COVID. And I think that's one of the most eloquent things and poignant things one could say. It's a distinction that she's drawing between the individual and the system. So as an individual, as a father, as a parent, as a human being, of course, nobody wants to have COVID, and we wouldn't want that for him. But systemically, as the president and the influence that he has, there is a part that is like, maybe this might be introducing a level of vulnerability and humility that might actually be good for the nation. And so it is a very complicated piece. Not everyone feels the same about that, but I wanted to make sure to address this. And so what I want to do for the rest of the sermon today is I actually want to talk a little bit about this distinction between the individual and the system so that we can think a little bit more about it and process it together. Esther Perel is a Belgian psychotherapist. She focuses primarily on couples and relationships. She's the author of two notable books. You may have heard of them. One of them is called Mating in Captivity, Unlocking Erotic Intelligence. The other one is called The State of Affairs, Rethinking Infidelity. And she is the host of the podcast, Where Should We Begin? It's on Spotify. It's truly an eye-opening and incredible podcast where the heart of it is that she just meets with couples one time, and they record that first session, and that's it. And they don't meet with her past that. And that recording is what the podcast is, and it's really powerful. So anyway, I was listening to one this week. It's a couple that's struggling with their physical intimacy and connection, as so many couples do. And the female partner in this couple is really struggling with why it is that she shuts down and feels resentful when her husband comes up and gives her a hug, right? She's just trying to put words and language to this feeling, this emotion of just shutting down. And her husband is also trying to understand, why is it that when I just give her a hug, she just gets resentful and she shuts off? So Esther Perel says this. She says, well, you know, what's important for you to realize, it's not the hug that's the problem. It's the meaning that's attached to the hug, because the wife can receive hugs from other people. It's just when her husband hugs her, that's when the problem is. And she says, it's the meaning that's attached to the hug. And for him, he's like, it's just a hug. What's the problem? But what Perel says is that the hug is actually coming with the weight of a few thousand years of patriarchy. And that's where the resistance is, that all of a sudden my husband is hugging me. Now there's all this expectation. I'm feeling like he's cueing me. I don't feel like it's just a passive hug. There's so much meaning behind the hug. So it's not the hug, it's the meaning. It's not the action or the inaction, but it's the historic and systemic weight behind the action. What are the culture's expectations of men and women in relationship? All that is coming into this hug. So that's one story. I want to tell you another story. I've been watching a documentary that there's 3 of these. It's Ewan McGregor and his best friend, the actor, Ewan McGregor and his best friend doing motorcycle travels. The first one was in 2004. It's called The Long Way Round. They started in England and they went all the way east and ended up in New York on motorcycles. The second one is called The Long Way Down, where they started up in Scotland and they get down to the South Africa. And now there's another one that's coming out, and it's called The Long Way Up, from South America up to Los Angeles. And in one of the episodes from the travels from Scotland down to South Africa, excuse me, they're in Egypt. And here they are, these Western guys on motorcycles, and they're on the side of the road and they're filming something just mundane, like a donkey pulling a cart, going on the highway. And so it's not mundane for us, of course, but there it is. And so here they are with these cameras, these Westerners, and all of a sudden, a couple of Egyptian men start yelling, and they walk up and they're raising their hands, and it looks like they're being very adversarial. And it's kind of a scary moment for Ewan McGregor and his friend and the cameraman. And as they're leaving, they're going, "Well, that was weird. We didn't do anything. We were just taking pictures." And it felt so uninstigated, and they were like wondering why these men would be so angry. And as I watched this as a Middle Easterner, I can tell you exactly why they were angry. It's because what McGregor and his friend were not recognizing is that there is a traumatic history of the West imposing itself upon and meddling in Middle Eastern affairs. And so just a random Westerner standing there, it's not just the individual, there's so much weight behind that person because of who and what they represent. So systems, gender, politics, religion, race. Historically, the abuses around these are systemic, where the status quo is maintained through laws and social narratives and taboos. And for a long time, they are conveniently substantiated even by science. These systemic injustices and prejudices, and still till today, in many ways, substantiated by divine revelation. Well, God told us that one people is better than another, or just go and conquer. And this way, one group maintains power over another, benefiting from this advantage while the other suffers. So these things that we're talking about, gender, politics, religion, race, these are systemic issues that are happening up here. And in both stories that I shared with you, a husband is like, I'm just giving a hug. And McGregor and his best friend are like, well, we didn't do anything. We're just standing on the side of the road. There's so much weight systemically. I experience this when I walk into a room with my collar on, not at St. John's, but if I were to walk into some public space, I am not just an individual standalone priest. I am a representative of institutional religion. And sometimes people have a lot to say or reactions to that because what I'm representing carries a lot of historical weight with it. I think about comments that I've heard personally from others, and we've even heard on the news. I didn't own slaves. I'm not the one that started racial prejudice. I was just born 30 years ago after the civil rights movement. Or I'm also a poor person in America. I have nothing to do with benefiting from racial prejudice. These statements that start to depict this thing of individualism, like I don't know why people are angry at me. So the 2 points that I want to make today are, first, that individualism minimizes systemic problems. And I'll get to the second point in a moment. So individualism, and we're going to get to the gospel today, don't worry. Individualism, this hallmark of modern Western Enlightenment thinking, in which a person is encouraged to take their own needs seriously and to pursue personal joy and contentment in life. This is an amazing thing. It's a beautiful thing. It has, in many ways, been a powerful instrument of liberation from oppressive groupthink. But there's another aspect to individualism, namely this theme that each person is a standalone entity responsible only for one's own actions. And this is unfortunately one of the main obstacles, I believe, when it comes to dealing with systemic racism. I'm just a standalone person. That's not my problem. I didn't contribute to this. Why are you looking at me? It's a problem because it blinds us from recognizing this universal psychosocial truth that if by the color of your skin or by your gender or your religion or your affiliations politically, if you happen to represent intentionally or unintentionally a system that has continued to cause inequity or injury and trauma, then whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, you are entangled in that story. So if you happen to be a representative, intentionally or unintentionally, of a system of injustice, you are entangled in that story. And you feel this entanglement whenever you find yourself on the receiving end of strong visceral reactions that in the moment might not feel like you had anything to do with, or feel undeserved or disproportionate to your action. You're like, I didn't do anything. Why such a strong reaction? And what I want to say today is that we can't afford to think individualistically about systemic problems. It's too naive and too costly. Healthcare, education, employment opportunities, poverty, the correctional system, and so many more. These are all systemic problems that we can't afford to think of individualistically. My best friend, John Depphaus, who has preached at St. John's before, he's a priest in Los Angeles. He's going to be preaching here next Sunday. But he said something about a year ago that was so inspiring to me, and I've just adopted this. He was talking about some instance with an interaction he was having with a colleague who was a female. And he said this, he said, look, my starting point is, I know as a man, I'm a part of the problem in this culture. I'm a part of the problem. That's his starting point. And I think that is so incredible to just recognize, well, I may not have done anything to this person, or I may not be walking around as like someone who's really closed-minded. I might be a pretty evolved person, but just by virtue of being a man in this culture, I am a part of the problem. Individualism, this idea of well, you know, like I'm responsible for my own actions. I had nothing to do with this. This minimizes in many ways systemic problems. And we can't afford to think individualistically about systemic issues, at least not if we're serious about change. And I'm not only talking about thinking individualistically in terms of the source of the problem. And this brings me to the second point today. I'm talking about it's an issue when we think individualistically about the solution to systemic issues. So the first one is that we can't afford to think individualistically about systemic issues because they minimize systemic problems. The second one is that systemic problems need systemic solutions. I was really, really frustrated with the presidential debate this past Tuesday. And I'm not going to say what you think I'm going to say. I expected one thing, and I got exactly what I expected. But where my true frustration was that night was when Joe Biden was invited to talk about the police and he was asked, do you support BLM? And this is what he said. He talked about how there are many good policemen out there and policemen and women, law enforcement, but there's a few bad apples. And what was hard for me about this is I don't disagree I think that the majority of law enforcement personnel are wonderful, good-intentioned individuals. I don't disagree with this. But he was asked a question about a systemic issue, and he answered the question with an individual solution. If you connected at all to the discourse right now, you would know that blaming this issue on a few bad apples within the police force is ignoring the systemic issues. You're just applying an individual solution or lens to a systemic problem. And this is where I want to jump now to the gospel today, because I think it has a lot to show us. The context of this parable that Jesus gives today, I'm just going to give you a meta context, and then I'll come closer. First of all, everything happening in chapter 21 to chapter 23 is taking place during what we know as Holy Week. It is the last week of Jesus before he is crucified. Everything that's taking place from the beginning of chapter 21 to the end is taking place in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, as we know historically, is was the center of political, religious, and cultural life in the land. So it was the capital, in the same way that Rome was the center of the Roman Empire. Jerusalem was the center of the Jewish world. It was not only physically the capital and the center, it was also symbolically so. So you have the temple right in the middle of Jerusalem, and that temple represented God's presence. So here is where we come closest to God when we come to Jerusalem. Now, the people who were in power in Jerusalem, in the heart, in the capital, were the chief priests, the religious leaders, the religious rulers. They were the ones who made the law. They were the ones who decided who was in or out. They're the ones who set custom rules. That's where all the power was. So here's Jesus. He comes to Jerusalem. The first thing that he does, we read about this last week when Lisa preached. The first thing he does is he walks into the temple and he turns over all the tables of the money changers. So the temple had its own financial system, and the first thing he does is he just turns over the tables in protest. And as a result of this, he ends up in this very adversarial interaction with the chief priests and the Pharisees. So the people who are at the top are coming to Jesus, and now they are questioning him, and they ask him, as we heard last week, by what authority are you doing these things? In response to this, Jesus gives 3 parables. We read the second of them today. Next week, we have the third one. After that, Jesus launches into this litany of denunciations, which in my Bible, the title of them is called 7 Woes. And in this litany, which you'll find in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus makes blanket statements about the scribes and the teachers of the law and the chief priests and the religious leaders. Blanket statements about the entire religious, economic, and political system that they're perpetuating. And he is so specific. He talks about them denying access to people. He talks about the way that they financially are harming others, how they're denying justice. He goes into so many specifics about the systemic issues. And just so that you kind of think about the nice Jesus, I want to complement this with the prophetic Jesus, who in chapter 23 uses these words to describe the religious leaders, those who are in power. He calls them hypocrites, blind guides. He calls them greedy, self-indulgent, whitewashed tombs. This is not like a string. He says these in different places. He calls them a brood of vipers and snakes. This is what Jesus is calling the religious leaders in the capital where all of the power exists. And he's turning over tables when he does this. And he says, woe to you, teachers of the law and the Pharisees. And that's how each of these 7 woes begins. Now, Surely not every religious leader was a bad leader. Surely there were good Pharisees and good priests and good scribes who were well-intentioned and good-hearted. Isn't it unfair that Jesus would be giving blanket statements like this about all of the scribes and all of the Pharisees? Notice that he doesn't say, now, not all of the Pharisees and the scribes are bad, but there's a few bad apples, and that's who I'm talking to. What about the individual? And this is the question that I want to bring back to us today. Jesus spends so much time talking about the individual. Why in this setting is he giving blanket statements about the leadership and the powerful? It's because Jesus understands that systemic problems need systemic solutions. And you can't excuse yourself and call yourself innocent if you're entangled in the system. If you're affiliated, you have to take responsibility for it. So for someone to come up and say to Jesus, that might be true about them, but it's not true of me, Jesus would say, you're a part of the system, and systemic problems need to be addressed systemically. I want to conclude today with a story. We have a sign out front in our church. It says, Black Lives Matter. And I received an email a few weeks ago, and did as well, from a very concerned resident in Chevy Chase. And just talking about how the BLM movement has so many problems, and he was kind of going into the specifics of why the movement should not be supported. And I reached out to him by phone. I just wanted to connect. I just wanted to say, hey, you're a neighbor also. I hear that this is really hard for you, and I just want to spend some time to create some connection here. I was under no illusion that either he or I were going to convince each other about anything. I just felt like the proper response to this kind of sentiment and strong emotional response is connection. And I just want to tell you, I got on the phone, and the first thing that he said is, do you know that everyone else who's responded to me for like comments that I've given like this, they've responded with like a 4-letter word. It's just been an email response, and it's been hostile and just like closed door. And he said, I want to tell you how much it means to me. I'm moved that you would reach out to me by phone and try to make a connection like this. So we started chatting. And I realized halfway into this 20-minute conversation that even though I believe there are systemic problems around racial injustice in America, he does not believe that there are any issues. He actually believes that there is equity, and that this is just something that is made up right now. And it was a difficult conversation, and I want you to know that when he hung up the phone, it wasn't in anger, it was truly in pain. And it was good for me to just say, wow, here's someone who is really frustrated and feels like something is really hurting him and bothering him. It's not just coming out of anger. But here's what I want to say about this, is that it is really hard to try to affect systemic change when you're simultaneously trying to make a case that there is an issue at all, that there are systemic issues. And of course, it would be so much easier to try to move forward and say, let's make systemic change right from the top, not just looking at the individual, but looking at the laws and the policies and the narratives in our culture. It would be so much easier to do this if everyone was on board and saying, yes, there is injustice and there are issues, and we should start dismantling this. But it is so hard to try to do this when you can't even agree on a narrative. And the reason I am just leaning into this today as my concluding story is that the BLM sign is nice. I think it's good, it's powerful, it sends the right message of solidarity with anyone who comes by the sign that is feeling like they're crushed by our society. It says, we are a safe place for you. And I think it is the right sign to have right now. But that is not the work that we have to do. I think that relationship building and book groups are amazing. They're good for us to grow in our own understanding of racial injustices in America. I think that building relationships across the aisle are essential for us to do. But that is not where our work ends with the individual understanding. We have to keep our eye on the prize, and we have to keep moving toward the goal and the main objective, which is systemic change, so that we don't have to have a sign out front that is making the most obvious statement that Black lives matter. And my hope and my prayer one day is that we'll reach that point where that is just a given and is not one that we actually have to say because it's not properly understood in our nation. So I want to give you an opportunity to be a part of this today, not just a message, but a call to action. We have set up an incredible series of adult forums this fall. They take place immediately following the service at 11 a.m., or if we end up sooner. Of course, when I preach this long, we're not going to end before 11. These adult forums are all focused on racial inequity in our nation and specifically about the systemic issues. And so every other week, today we have a speaker, and we'll tell you about that in a moment. The week after that, we're debriefing it together. And the ultimate goal, where we're moving to, is how can we be involved in systemic change as a church? And so we are understanding, we're growing, but all with the objective of doing something with this. And so if you're skeptical or if you're totally on board, these are the forums, these are the conversations that we need to be a part of. So I invite you to take the time to be a part of them. If you can't make it, we're recording them as well so that you can be a part of those conversations. Let's pray together. God, you call us to action in the same way that you believed in action. You call us to see the individual when we need to see the individual. And you call us to see the system when we need to see the system. I pray for Donald Trump and for everyone else who's contracted COVID in our nation, who is struggling as individuals and trying to survive. I pray also, Lord, for our president, for humility, and for just a vulnerability at a time where what is needed most is softness and calmness and just perspective on where the nation is and where we need to go. Bless us, God, in all of our vulnerabilities, and we ask this in your holy name. Amen.